Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Well, we've got another customer requested topic today. Here it is. Automatic screen capture for machine documentation. The idea for this topic came from a colleague of mine. He asked for the best method of capturing live screen data for the purposes of machine documentation. Now, after thinking about it just for a second, I said, hey, just use the screen capture feature available in every Horner OCS. And then he told me that he had more than 150 screens that he wanted to capture. And after thinking about that for a while, I realized doing that all manually would be a lot of work. So today we're going to show you how not only to capture screens from your machine for user documentation manually, but we're also going to show you how you can do it automatically all at once. Let's get started. We're going to start by going through a couple of features that you may not be familiar with, starting with screen captures and then moving on to file name counters. We're going to show you how to use these features to capture runtime screens as image files. And we're going to show you how to do that manually as well as automatically for all of your screens. And there'll be plenty of demonstrations. So let's get started. So what is the screen capture feature? Well, it's really analogous to the print screen button on your computer. So when you initiate a screen capture in the Horner OCS, it gives you an exact image of whatever was on the screen at the time, just the way your print screen button works. So it really is pretty straightforward. Now, what can you use the screen capture for? We've already talked about the fact you could use screen captures, the images from your screen captures, as part of your user documentation, but I've seen it used a couple other ways as well. For instance, I've seen it used where a customer has a particular alarm that when they detect that alarm in their logic, they not only trigger an alarm through the alarm feature in the Horner OCS, but they also trigger a screen capture of a particularly key screen that is showing machine parameters. That way, not only do they, of course, have the time and date that the alarm occurred through the alarm feature, but they also have an image they can go back and look at if they want that captures what was going on the machine at that time. So it's kind of a different way of doing it versus, say, data logging, for instance. Now, another way I've seen it used is to create kind of a digital signature file for inspectors, for instance. So let's say you have an inspector, comes to the machine, checks out a part, and he wants to leave a digital record that he did the inspection and that he checked out the part. Well, you could do that on the Horner OCS by creating a screen that had the information for the part that he had basically inspected. And it also could have a field on that screen utilizing the notepad feature. That's kind of a etch-a-sketch type feature where in that area where the notepad object is placed, you can kind of use your finger to scribble a signature in that field. And then when a file capture is executed, that screen then has a record of what the inspector did and which inspector it was that did the inspection along with his signature. So that's some different ways you could use the screen capture feature in addition to what we're talking about today. Okay, how do you configure the screen capture feature? Let's go through that next. Now, it's really pretty straightforward. The first step is to assign a Boolean variable that's going to act as the trigger to initiate the screen capture. And then next you have to specify a file name path. All right, now that file name path could be just a fixed file name, okay, if you want to have the same name every time you do a screen capture. But that could be problematic if you're going to be doing multiple screen captures. You don't want that file to be continuously overwritten. So you might want to utilize the next feature we're going to talk about, which is the file name counters feature. So what is that? Well, that's analogous to what happens on your phone or digital camera when you continuously take snapshots. They aren't all given the same name. They're given different names, and it's usually some sort of prefix along with, maybe a 4-digit number at the end of that, so that as snapshots are taken, the file names are always different. So really, the file name counters feature in the Horner OCS follows that same approach. All right, so how do you configure it? Well, first of all, you've got 4 file name counters to work with. Okay, 1, 2, 3, and 4. You start by assigning a variable to the file counter. Now, what is that variable for? Well, it basically shows you or holds a numeric value that represents the current value of the file name counter. And it's a 32-bit double integer value. Then you have a max field to fill out that shows you how many maximum digits you want to include with the file name counter. And then you have to decide, do I want this counter to automatically increment every time it is accessed? In other words, every time you do a screen capture and it's accessed, do you want that file counter to increment? Probably, most cases you do, but not always. And then also the next decision is, do you want that file counter to wrap? In other words, when it gets to the end of the max value, in this case, maybe 9999, do you want it to go back to 0 or not? Those are your choices. And again, you have 4 file name counters to choose from. Now you'll notice there in the description for each one at the top of each section there, you'll see $1, $2, $3. What is that all about? Well, that's the wildcard designation for each of the file name counters. So that's what you would place in the field of each file name. Okay, I'll go back to my screen capture configuration, and you can see that $1 has been included in the file name path line there for the screen capture. So that indicates that the first part of that file name is going to be effectively the counter number 0000 through 9999 in my configuration case. And then the file number extension is going to be, JPEG, bitmap, or PNG. That's placed on there automatically. So that's how you can use kind of the screen capture and the file name counter kind of in conjunction with each other. All right, so now let's kind of go through the 2 different cases we're talking about today, and that is manually capturing your screen image information and then doing that automatically all at once. So let's start with the workflow for capturing a single screen manually. How would that work? Well, of course, the first step is you're going to have to set up your screen capture feature so that you actually have a Boolean variable that you can use as a trigger to instigate the screen capture. And then as part of that configuration, you can either utilize just a fixed file name if you choose. If you're doing it manually, you may want to just leave it as a fixed file name, or you might want to go ahead and incorporate a file name counter so that every time you do a screen capture, it increments. If you do decide to utilize that, of course, you then have to set up the file name counter and include the wildcard designation in the path for your screen capture. Now, you're going to basically run your machine, go to the screen that you want to capture, turn on the screen capture control variable, which triggers the screen capture. It's going to instigate the capture and then save the image file where you specified. Next, you retrieve it and you're done. Okay, so really it's quite easy. But like I mentioned in the open, if you have 150 screens you need to do this with, that's pretty labor intensive. So let me show you how to do this manually, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how you can do it automatically. So let's take a look at a down and dirty configuration so that we can quickly do manual screen captures. All right, so we need to make sure we're displaying a screen of some sort. Doesn't matter which screen. Why is that important? Well, when we're on the user interface tab, if we're not displaying a screen, we won't be able to click on screen capture or file counters. They will have been grayed out. All right, let's start with the screen capture configuration here. Okay, so under control variable, we have to assign a Boolean bit. Okay, doesn't matter which one, you just have to assign a Boolean variable here. And then under file name, you have a couple different ways you can go. Now, I'm going to utilize the file counters, so I've got a special string here that allows me to do that. I'll come back here after we go through the file counter setup here. Okay, so I'm going to use file counter 1. Remember, file counters are useful because it helps us ensure that as we do multiple sequential screen captures that they can have unique numbers, and when we're doing it manually, it helps to have auto increment on. Okay, so for file counter number 1, which has a designation of $1, I've set up a variable for monitoring the value of file name counter number 1, the decimal value. It's a 32-bit decimal value or double integer. And I've set a maximum of 9999, so 4 digits. And I've decided not to wrap when it gets to the maximum. Okay, so that's how I've set up the file name counter. Now let's go back and take a look at our screen capture setup, and you'll see what I put here. So in this case, I decided not to specify a separate path or a subdirectory or subfolder for the screen captures. I'm just putting it in the root directory. And then I have $1 U4. What's that all about? $1 specifies the first file counter, and U4 specifies a 4-digit unsigned value. And that's just the syntax you need to use to take advantage of the file counter. All right, now I've got bitmap selected here. I could select JPEG, bitmap, or PNG. Now, with the canvas unit, you don't have to worry about manually putting the extension down. I know on some earlier versions of Seascape, you had to manually put the extension down for some models. But with the latest version of Seascape and the latest firmware, the file extensions added automatically, either JPG, BMP, or PNG. Okay, so that's the setup we need to use for doing manual file captures. All right, we're just going to do it from the data watch window. So I have my screen capture trigger set here. Just for grins, I've put the user screen system variable on the screen so we can see what screen is currently being displayed. And then I've got the screen counter variable I'm monitoring just so I can see the current value of the screen counter, the automatic file name counter. All right, so the next step is, since we're ready to do our capture, we need to make sure that the screen that is displayed on the OCS is the one that we want. So here's my main menu. Let's say this is the screen I want. If it wasn't, I would switch to a different screen, but let's say this is the screen I want. So back to Seascape. Again, I'm triggering this strictly from the data watch window. I'll turn this trigger bit to a 1. This is my control variable for my screen capture. Okay, and it wasn't obvious that that stayed on, is it? Well, here's why. Basically, as soon as I turned that bit on, the OCS firmware saw that and acknowledged it by turning it right back off again. And the way I know that happened, even though I couldn't see it in the watch window because it happened too fast, is I saw the screen counter increment up to 2. Why did it increment up to 2? Well, every time the file name counter is accessed, it's going to increment. And when we perform the screen capture trigger, it caused the increment of the screen counter. So that's a nice bit of feedback that it should have worked, okay? Now, where's the file? Well, let's go look on the unit and see if we can find it. Okay, so let me switch over to my bench view. I'll pull up the system menu, go to media, and then looky here, 0001.bitmap. Looks like the file's right where it should be, right in the root directory. If I click on it, this is a file that the OCS can display, and you can tell it's just an image by the dotted line. You can just barely see around the perimeter there. That means it's an image and it's not what's live on the actual unit itself. Okay, so our manual screen capture went fine. If I were to do another screen capture, it would be 002 instead of 001. So let's just quickly do that again. I'll close that. This time I'll navigate to a different screen. Okay, let's go back to Seascape. Let's instigate another screen capture. Okay, our screen counter incremented, so that looks like that should have worked. Let's go back to the system menu. If I can click in the right spot here. Go to the media, and we should see, yep, sure enough, 0001 and 0002. Okay, so that was a manual screen capture. That really wasn't all that difficult to perform, but if you have 100 plus screens, you may want to find an automatic method. Now let's take a look at how we're going to make this happen automatically so we can capture all of our screens with a minimum of effort. So it's going to start out really about the same way that it did manually, and that is through the setup of the screen capture feature and the file counter feature. However, we're going to be using a user-defined function block to do the automation, so we need to make sure that the screen capture and file counter features are set up exactly as the UDFB would expect. And of course, I'll be showing you how to do that. Now, once we've added this UDFB into our program and assigned the variables to it and, basically enabled it so it can do its job, well, we're going to end up with all of our screens captured, a few minutes later if we've got a bunch of them to capture. Now let's take a closer look at that user-defined function block that I'm talking about here. It's called Screen Grab, and you'll be able to download it from the Horner website if you choose. It has 3 inputs and it has 3 outputs. The first input is the enable input. That's a Boolean. You need to turn that on and leave it on until it completely finishes with the screen captures. You'll specify through a couple double integer variables the first screen and the last screen to be captured. And then on the output side, it has a screen capture Boolean, which needs to be assigned to the control variable for the screen capture feature. In other words, that variable that when turned on triggers the screen capture. That's what we have to assign there. It also has a screen counter, which is a double integer which you can monitor that shows you which screens are being captured at any given moment. Okay, so you should be seeing that count up as it's executing. And then when it's all done, that done bit will turn on. Now it takes a couple of seconds to capture each screen. So if you've got 100 screens, that's a couple hundred seconds, right? So that might take 3 or 4 minutes. So that means that you may need to turn it on, go get a coffee, come back, and it'll be done. Now, how specifically does the Screen Grab UDFB work internally? Well, the beauty of UDFBs is you don't really need to worry about that. I've done all the work for you. So again, it's not a big deal as to how exactly it works. But if you're curious, it's basically just performing the same steps automatically that you would be manually, but it's doing so with a timing that ensures completely reliable screen captures of all the screens in succession. Now let's take a look at how we can implement this Screen Grab UDFB and how you can do that for your next machine. Okay, let's take a look at our automatic configuration here. Okay, so let's start out by taking a look at the fact that I have added a user-defined function block to my program. Now, I mentioned earlier it should be as close to the end as possible. I went ahead and created a special main loop module at the end called capture, and the only thing in there is this user-defined function block. Okay, now where did this user-defined function block come from? Well, I started by downloading a CPU file from the Horner website. And then under logic modules, if you right click, you can import that CPU logic module. Once you do that, it'll show up down here under UDFB modules, and it'll show up also in your toolbox here as well. Okay, so that's how to get that UDFB into your project. Then you just drag it onto your logic area. It'll ask you to name it, to give it an instance name. You assign the variables and away you go. But before we dive into further details on this user-defined function block, let's take a look at the screen capture and file counter setup, which is critical for this to work properly. Okay, so we have to make sure we're displaying a screen, okay, so that when we're in the user interface section, we can click on screen capture and file counters and that they're not grayed out. All right, let's go ahead and click on screen capture. You can see a very similar setup to what I just showed you with manual, but I made a couple changes. I left the name of the trigger variable or the control variable the same, but I went ahead and put our screens in a subfolder. You don't have to do that in this case, but I just went ahead and illustrated that, so I added that to the path. I also added SCRN as an alphanumeric first 4 digits of the file name. Still have those 4 digits from file counter number 1. All right, and it's still going to be a bitmap. That's what I choose to use. And then as we look at the file counters, okay, that is set up almost exactly the same as I did for manual. The only difference is I took off the auto increment flag. That's because the user-defined function block is going to go ahead and increment the file counter for me. So I turned it off. So to make this work properly, do not have the auto increment on. Okay, now that that's on, let's go back and take a closer look at our user-defined function block. We've got those 3 inputs and 3 outputs. Okay, so our enable bit that you turn on and leave on to have it execute, first screen, last screen, screen capture, which is the bit that has to be the same bit that was assigned as the control register or trigger register for your screen capture feature. That's also critical. Our screen counter that we can monitor just to watch it go. And then we have our done bit that we can monitor that shows us when it's done. Okay, so that's all critical. All right, so now let's take a look at the watch window. All right, and let's add the variables we need to the watch window so that we can execute this from Cscape. Okay, so let's grab our enable bit. Okay, let's grab first screen. Let's grab last screen. Let's take a look at our screen capture bit. Let's also take a look at our screen counter, and then let's monitor the done bit. Okay, we've done that. All right, we're good. Okay, so now we can execute this right from the watch window. Now, first thing we have to do before we enable it, we need to set the first screen that we want to capture. So I'm going to make mine screen number 1, and I'm going to make my last screen screen number 15. That's all the screens I have in my project. Now, I don't have to do all of them. I could do any subset I wanted. They just have to be, consecutive numbers. All right, so I've accomplished that. Now let's go ahead and enable this function block. All right, and you can see we can monitor here, and you can see the screen counter counting up as it sequentially is going through and capturing our screens. Now it's taking a couple seconds each to do the screens, which takes a little bit of time, but not that bad, which means that for 15 screens, which is what I'm capturing, it's going to take 30-ish seconds. If I had 150 screens, I'd probably want to go get a cup of coffee because it's going to take 5 or 6 minutes to complete. Okay, but still, in the overall scheme of things, that's not bad. Okay, our done bit has turned on. Let's go ahead and get rid of our enable now, since we know we're complete. We have no reason to leave it on. Okay, and now let's take a look at the files that were created. Okay, I've now extracted the memory card from my OCS and popped it in my computer. Let's take a look at it. Okay, so if you remember correctly, there was a subdirectory or folder called screens, which is where our file should reside. And sure enough, there they are with the proper prefix on the file name and with the file counter. All right, and then effectively, if I want to look at one of these just to verify it's there we go. Okay, so I now have this graphic file, this image file, and I've got all of the ones for my machine, and I can use these in my user documentation. That does it for our technical content for today. There's still time to sign up for training, but don't delay. Get to our website and sign up today. There are lots of ways to interact with Horner online at hornerautomation.com. Of course, our YouTube channel has hundreds of videos like these, and the latest Horner news is usually found on LinkedIn. Next week, we have another customer-requested technical topic. We're going to do a deep dive on the indirect move instruction. It's incredibly useful, and we're going to tell you all about that next week. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, don't hesitate to do so. It doesn't cost anything. And if you choose notifications when you subscribe, you'll be notified every time we go live or every time we post a new video. Okay, so stay warm this week. Stay out of the snow, or maybe enjoy the snow, whichever you'd prefer. And let's all get out there and do some good.